All right, let's get into it. Today, we're taking a look at the life and legacy of Kofi Annan. He was the seventh Secretary General of the United Nations, and he was a man who, interestingly enough, rose up from inside the system to try and reshape the entire world.
This right here was so much more than just a phrase for Kofi Annan. It's something he actually learned at his boarding school back in Ghana. And it wasn't just some nice saying. It was really the moral compass that guided his entire career. Honestly, it's the key to understanding the man.
So let's start at the very beginning. How does a boy born in the British colony of the Gold Coast, before it was even the nation of Ghana, end up leading the world's most prominent global institution? Well, his journey was anything but ordinary.
Now, what's really fascinating here is just how much his identity was shaped by his roots. In the Akan tradition, names carry deep, deep meaning. So he was Kofi, the Friday-born, and his middle name, Ata, actually means twin. And look, these aren't just trivia facts. They're a reminder that this huge global figure was deeply grounded in a very specific, rich culture. And as you can see from this timeline, his climb was just steady and determined. From getting his education in the US to his very first job with a UN agency, Annan spent decades, literally decades, learning the incredibly complex machinery of global bureaucracy from the inside. Each step was just preparing him for the next, all leading up to his appointment as head of peacekeeping during the really turbulent 1990s. So, here's the crucial point. Kofi Annan wasn't an outsider brought in to fix things, no way. He was the ultimate insider, the first ever UN staffer to be elected to the top job. And that gave him a totally unique perspective. He knew the system's strengths, sure, but more importantly, he knew its deep-seated flaws from the inside out. So armed with all that insider knowledge, Annan didn't just want to run the UN, he wanted to reinvent it. His mission, really, was to drag this 20th century institution kicking and screaming into the 21st, to get it ready for a whole new era of global challenges. This really lays out the core pillars of his ambitious agenda. You see, it wasn't just about tweaking the UN's bureaucracy. He launched these big, forward-looking ideas that represented fundamental shifts in how the UN would actually operate and what it could achieve. And the ambition behind initiatives like the Millennium Development Goals, it was just staggering. This wasn't just talk. The MDGs were a set of concrete targets for the new century, with this one central goal of freeing over a billion people from extreme poverty. It was a clear, measurable, and honestly, an audacious promise to the world.
Annan also got that governments couldn't solve these massive global problems all on their own. So he created the UN Global Compact. The idea was to bring the private sector to the table, to urge corporations to embrace principles on human rights, labor, and the environment. His goal, in his own words, was to give a human face to the global market.
But his time in office wasn't just about launching bold new initiatives. It was absolutely defined by profound global crises that tested his leadership, the UN's real power, and, frankly, the very conscience of the world.
And we have to talk about the shadow of Rwanda. As the head of peacekeeping, Annan faced intense criticism for the UN's failure to stop the 1994 genocide. General Dallaire, the force commander on the ground, even called him overly passive. Years later, though, Annan didn't try to hide from this. He publicly acknowledged his deep regret, saying he believed he could and should have done more to sound the alarm. And that failure, it directly led him to pose this haunting question. This really became the central dilemma of his work. Where does a nation's right to govern itself end, and where does the world's responsibility to protect its people begin? This very question is what drove his push for the responsibility to protect doctrine. His second term was rocked by even more crises. He stood firm against the 2003 invasion of Iraq, famously calling it illegal because it didn't have the UN Security Council's backing. That move put him directly at odds with the United States. And at the same time, he had to navigate this huge oil for food scandal, a massive corruption crisis that, while it didn't implicate him personally, exposed some really serious flaws within the very institution he was fighting to reform. So after he left the UN in 2006, you might think he'd take a break. But Kofi Annan's work was far from over. He just seamlessly transitioned into a new role, that of a global elder statesman, continuing his lifelong mission for peace. He became the chairman of the Elders, which is this incredible group founded by none other than Nelson Mandela. And make no mistake, this was not a retirement job.
It was a continuation of his work on a more independent, focused stage, leveraging the collective wisdom of world leaders to tackle some of the world's most stubborn conflicts.
And this picture, with him alongside fellow elders Jimmy Carter and South Sudan, really captures what his post-UN career was all about. It wasn't about giving speeches from afar. It was about being on the ground, hands-on, working to make sure new nations had a peaceful start. It's the perfect example of his continued diplomatic work. I mean, his commitment was just relentless. He started his own foundation to keep his work going. He successfully mediated a violent political crisis in Kenya, and then he took on the seemingly impossible job as an envoy to Syria, and even led a commission investigating the Rohingya crisis. He was constantly on the front lines of the world's toughest problems.
So when you put it all together, what is the lasting impact of this quiet revolutionary? How is he going to be remembered on the world stage that he worked so hard to reform?
Well, the crowning recognition really came in 2001. He and the UN were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The committee celebrated his efforts for their work for a better organized and more peaceful world. I mean, what a fitting tribute to his life's work of trying to revitalize the very institution he so deeply believed in.
In the end, Annan's journey really shows us both the incredible potential and, at the same time, the stark, frustrating limits of global diplomacy. And it leaves us with the very same question he wrestled with his entire life, one that remains as urgent today as it ever was. How should the world balance the sovereignty of nations with our shared responsibility to protect people?